Hello, my name is James, and I'm going to talk to you about an Oracy-based curriculum that I was involved in designing and teaching and evaluating over the last 10 years. I work for an organisation called Oracy Cambridge, and I also work at the UCL Institute of Education in the Centre for Educational Leadership, and I also run an independent consultancy, which is a long way of saying I work with teachers a lot. And I often ask teachers a question: if you could wave a magic wand, what's the one thing that you would change about your pupils? And you often hear lots of different answers to that question. People say things like, I wish they would read for pleasure, or I wish they were more knowledgeable. And those are all good things to wish for. But this talk is about something else, because by far the most common response that I hear when I ask that question is like a variation on a theme. Something like, I want them to be more independent, to be more confident or proactive. And then you hear the flip side of that. People phrase things in quite negative terms. Sometimes they say that the children, it feels like they need to spoon feed them, that they're very needy, or that they're very passive, for example. And there's this phrase that a teacher used recently when I asked this question. They said the resident evil of fear of failure. And that's something that I'll talk a little bit about later on. It's really interesting that there's this very widespread, almost endemic fear of failure among young people. They're afraid to put their hand up and get involved in conversations. They get very fearful around exams and so on. They get very fearful about public speaking. And so I've been immersed in this journey, if you like, for the last 10 years to get to the bottom of this, to see whether or not we can teach children in such a way that they become more confident, proactive, curious, independent, effective learners, self-regulated learners. So 10 years ago, I received an email asking for people to be involved in a Year 7 Learning to Learn curriculum to design and teach it. So we had a competitive selection process to decide who would be on this team, which was really important because all the teachers were really excited and really up for it. And we were given the whole of Year 7 for 5 lessons a week to do with as we wanted, which was this incredible opportunity. And I realised at the outset that I really wanted to evaluate this and to collect data on it in the most robust way possible. As it turned out, Year 7 for 5 lessons a week was only the beginning. We then got timetabled lessons in Year 8 and in Year 9, and over time it essentially developed into a whole school approach to learning that had these 3 elements. It had timetabled lessons. We also had embedded elements across the curriculum, so we had shared pedagogical strategies, and they were developed through having a joined-up approach to CPD. And then thirdly, really importantly, we had strategies for transfer, because in the past, in Learning to Learn, transfer doesn't always happen. You have to carefully manage that transfer out of the learning skills curriculum, out of the learning skills classroom, and transfer into subject learning. So I signed up to do a PhD to evaluate the impact of this, and that turned out to be an 8-year study, a mixed methods evaluation, where I followed 4 cohorts of children from Year 7 through to Year 11. There was 1 control cohort, the pre-learning to learn cohort, if you like, and then 3 learning skills cohorts. And the main outcome of that was to look at the student progress in subject learning across the curriculum. So I'll cut to the end of this story, if you like, and then we'll go back to looking at the Oracy element within this curriculum. The headline figures were that these children went on to achieve the best set of results that that school had ever seen by some margin. We measured their progress at the end of Year 9 and again at the end of Year 11, and there were statistically significant gains in subject learning across the curriculum. And in particular, it was advantageous for disadvantaged children. So as you can see here, the whole year group did much better compared with the control cohort, and non-pupil premium children did better than their counterparts in the control group as well. But as you can see with these bars on the right here, this curriculum was especially beneficial for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. And just to drill down on that data for a moment, this was the pupil premium gap at the end of Year 9, so after 3 years of Learning to Learn. So the white bars are the control cohort, and the red bars are the Learning to Learn cohort. So if you look at English on the left there, by the end of Year 9, in the pre-learning to learn in the control cohort, the pupil premium gap was 30%, which is around about average. It's a little bit higher than average for the nation. And in the Learning to Learn cohort, the gap had closed so far that, as you can see with these 5 subjects where the bar has gone beneath the 0 line, the gap had closed so far that in these subjects, pupil premium pupils were outperforming non-pupil premium students by the end of Year 9. This is what you would expect to see if disadvantage was not a predictor of educational outcomes, then we would expect to see a balanced picture like this. And if we focus in on those 2 bars on the right-hand side, This is all of that data combined together. So if you combine all subjects together, at the end of year 9, the pupil premium gap in the control cohort was 25%, and in the learning to learn cohort, it was just 2%. And we had almost exactly the same pattern of results 2 years later when these children got to GCSE. We also did some student interviews. There's a lovely excerpt here where one student, Zena we'll call her, said, "When you're in learning skills, you learn how to do things that you can use in other lessons, and you learn how to be more confident, and what you learn sticks with you and teaches you to act the same in the other lessons." I was really disappointed because this was when Learning to Learn was going to be discontinued in year 9. This was a few years later. I was really disappointed when I found that we weren't going to have learning skills this year. But then I thought back to last year, and I thought about everything that I've learned and how I can use that in lessons. And it kind of sticks with you, and then it becomes a part of you, which is lovely, isn't it? That this is something that I really think a lot about, is that people talk about metacognition and self-regulation and oracy sometimes as a way of improving exam results. And that's a good thing to do. It's a good idea to improve exam results. But there's more to it than that. We're talking here about a vision of education that's rooted in self-actualization, in becoming more fully yourself, in developing a stronger sense of identity, finding your voice literally and metaphorically, and sort of taking your place in the world. So it's really nice to see this kind of feedback that the children were saying, this becomes a part of you. We also saw similar feedback from teachers. So this was from an interview with Caroline, the head of PE. She said in Key Stage 3, the difference between Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4 was like night and day. She had this contribution from all the students. They're not as scared as getting things wrong, so we managed to address that fear of failure thing. They're much more forthcoming, they give it a go, and they're more prepared to be critical of one another, and she definitely thought that learning skills had influenced that. And here's an excerpt from a student's learning journal. She said, "Learning to learn helps me with other subjects because it helps us revise and get ready for stuff. Also, when we were learning about fixed mindset and growth mindset, it was helping us to take in information and how to become better learners. Learning to learn also helps us with life, because in maths you learn stuff like the area of a circle, and in science we learn the chemical formula of photosynthesis, but you don't learn how to ace a job interview or how to handle life crises, because without learning to learn you can't learn any of that stuff, and that's why it's so important." So you could see that the children were also seeing that this is important for them as people. This is not just about learning stuff to pass exams. This study took place within the tradition of learning to learn, and this has been going for years. As you can see, this is the published literature on learning to learn, and it sort of started to really get going in the 1970s when John Flavell and Anne Brown and others did their initial work around metacognition. And as you can see, it's on this exponential rise, and it doesn't show any signs of slowing down soon. So we've added to this literature in the last few years. So this is a paper I wrote with my PhD supervisor, Neil Mercer. This was the Key Stage 3, the interim findings. And then 2 years later, we wrote the GCSE findings up in the Impact Journal. And I very recently finished, in fact yesterday, would you believe, finished a book that I've been writing for about the last 3 years that I've co-authored with my colleague Kate McAllister, called Fear is the Mind Killer, Why Learning to Learn Deserves Lesson Time and How to Make It Work for Your Pupils. So this is going to be out in the next few weeks, which is really exciting. And it tells the story of this learning skills curriculum, which was essentially, the big idea was that it was a complex intervention, meaning an intervention with many moving parts. And it's sort of based on the idea of marginal gains theory. So the marginal gains from each individual thing that you do stack up and interact, and you get this larger effect size overall. So there was lots of things in the learning skills curriculum, but really it boils down to these 3 key ideas. Metacognition, which we define as monitoring and controlling your thought processes. Self-regulation, which is sort of like the flip side of that, which is monitoring and controlling your feelings and behaviors. So metacognition is sort of monitoring your internal environment. Self-regulation is monitoring and controlling how you interact with your external environment. And the third piece of the puzzle was Oracy, which you probably won't need telling about if you signed up for Oracy October, but which we defined as developing effective speaking and listening skills across a range of contexts. So a couple of years ago, I wrote a report for the Welsh Government with Neil Mercer called Oracy Across the Welsh Curriculum, where we looked at the rationale for why we should do Oracy. And again, if you signed up for Oracy October, you're probably on board with this. But just very briefly, we identified three key areas of impact that we can find strong evidence for in the research literature. The first, cognitive outcomes. If you want to increase your ability to achieve well in a range of subjects, improve literacy, improve verbal reasoning and non-verbal reasoning, outcomes for young people with special educational needs, for bilingual pupils, there's really good evidence that focusing on Oracy will help you achieve those things. And that's already, a really good rationale for why we should do this work. But there's also social and emotional outcomes. Again, there's lots of very strong evidence for this, that it helps children become more confident, that it helps them develop a sense of self-esteem, that it helps them to engage in their classes more, partly because they feel more actively involved, because they've got the confidence to participate. That confidence spills over into their peer relations, into their relations with their family at home. They develop the ability to empathize, to handle stress. They develop a sense of emotional resilience. So there's a whole range of really good reasons why we should do this. And then the third category was life outcomes, that there's good evidence that we can overcome social disadvantage. There's fewer exclusions, there's less juvenile offending, and Oracy is also linked to improved future earnings. So if you're looking for reasons to do something in schools, you can't really find anything that's got a stronger rationale than Oracy. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on 5 ways in which we developed Oracy through the Learning Skills curriculum. I'm going to talk about talk rules. I'm going to talk about something called the HAT method, a way to develop talk rules in a really short space of time. As a teacher, I found that this was the most transformative thing that I ever did, was embedding the use of talk rules. I'm going to talk about an idea called collaboration and complexity, which is just about pupil grouping. I'll explain in a moment. The third one is P4C. This was really my way into Oracy, was thinking about speaking and listening through philosophy for children, which is an amazing approach to teaching and learning. And then structured debates and presentational talk. So I'll run through these briefly in turn. First of all, talk rules. People often find in schools, teachers are often quite critical of group work, or they find that group work is really difficult, which is not surprising because often children are put into groups and told to get on with a task without first being taught how to interact productively in teams. And so what we want to do is to teach them how to speak together in a productive way, and especially using something that we refer to as exploratory talk. As children can talk together in a number of ways. Often when left to their own devices, they speak together in a disputational way, where they're sort of in a sort of atmosphere of competition, really, rather than collaboration, where it's like, yes it is, no it's not, that sort of thing. Or they can talk together in a cumulative way, where the talk sort of stacks up and they're basically waiting for the other person to stop talking so that they can say their thing, but they're not really critically engaging with one another's ideas. But what we can do is we can teach children how to speak together in an exploratory way, where they are all encouraged to contribute, they take turns, they listen actively, they ask questions of one another, they build on what's gone before, they give reasons for their thinking, and they challenge other people to give reasons if they don't provide them, and so on. The group seeks agreement so that they try to work out any points of disagreement. So if they're working on a puzzle, one person says, I think the answer is 6, and the other one says, no, it's 3, then they just go, why do you think it's 6, and why do you think it's 3, and can we actually reach a point of agreement? Which is a really, really powerful thing to do. So how can we get children to speak and listen together in this way? Well, it's actually surprisingly easy. I'm going to talk about a method called the HAT method. So we would just pass a hat around and give them each a piece of scrap paper, split it into 2, and on one piece of paper they go, when group talk goes well, and they write some examples of what's it like when group talk goes well. So they say things like people listen to each other, the sorts of things that we saw on the previous slide. And then they put them into a hat, and that's important because then they can contribute their ideas anonymously, because sometimes children feel hesitant to say, they wouldn't want to put their hand up and say, I don't like it when people talk over me, because, they might just not feel comfortable sharing that in front of the class. But if you anonymize it through the HAT method, then that's why that's a good idea. Then you do the same thing for when group talk goes badly, and you compile all of those ideas into 2 lists, you place them side by side, and then ask the children to see if they can come up with a set of ground rules to make it so that all of the things on the left-hand column when talk goes well do happen, and all of the things on the right-hand side don't happen. And so you collect all of those in. It's usually a good idea to collect those overnight and then to type them up, because it can take a little while. And then you distill them down into about 7 ground rules. And they often change from one class to the next, but they often look something like this. I'm not going to read these out. You can pause the video if you wish. When children learn to speak together in this way, it's absolutely transformative in the quality of conversations that you see and hear around the classroom. We used to put these up on the wall. We can get the children to all sign their name to them, and if we're setting up a group task, we'd revisit the talk rules and just remind ourselves what it is that we're looking for today. The children can use these things as targets, so they might say, okay, so today I'm going to try to speak a bit less so that everybody else gets the chance to speak. Or they might say, I'm going to really try to listen carefully today because I'm thinking about my own thing and I really need to tune into what people are saying, and I'm going to look at them when they're talking, for example. And again, at the end of the lesson, you can use talk rules to reflect back, so that as well as reflecting on the content of the lesson, you can also reflect on the process of learning. How well were we able to share our ideas today? How good were we at giving reasons for our thinking? How good are we at working towards agreement when we're working in groups? So you can use talk rules in a whole range of ways. Like I say, it's super powerful. The second one is collaboration and complexity. This is about pupil groupings. When children are put into seating plans, they're often put into seating plans so that they're not sitting with their friends. And that's an understandable thing because teachers often find that children, maybe talk off task when they're sitting with their friends. But if you sit down and ask children, what's it like when you're asked to talk to your table partners? There's a whole range of reasons why a conversation might not go very well in a lesson. It might be that they've never spoken to that person before, so they just feel nervous about talking to them. They don't really know who they are. Or maybe there's a sort of one of them is more popular than the other, and there's like a popularity gradient. So one child feels a bit intimidated by talking to another. And there's all these sort of micro-political issues within the classroom that we might not even be aware of as teachers, but for children it's all they can see sometimes. And so what we decided to do was to allow the children to sit in pairs of their choosing at first, so that they could get really good at speaking in an exploratory way in a pair of their choosing. And then in the second half term, we would introduce a third person into the groups, and again we would work through a load of activities to help them get really good at speaking together in an exploratory way when there's 3 people in the group. And already it's a lot more complicated, a 3 than a 2, because in a pair there's only one relationship, isn't there? There's A-B. When there's 3 people, there's A-B, there's A-C, and there's B-C, so it's 3 times more complicated. And then in half term 4, there's 4 children in the group, and now it's even more complicated because there's 6 relationships. So we would let them go through that process, and then in the second half of the year, we did the same thing again, but the teacher chose who the pairs in the groups were. And we made it really explicit that by the end of this year, you're going to be able to have a really high-level conversation using the features of exploratory talk with any group that you're put in any group size. So we mixed the pupils up all the time, and they really, really appreciated that. So they're being gently but persistently nudged out of the apparent comfort of their friendship groups, and they really got to know one another very well, and the bonds that formed between those classes were incredible because of this process. So I really recommend doing that. Philosophy for children, I'm not going to go into in any great detail because it takes quite a while to get trained up in the approach, but it's essentially, if you're not familiar with it, it's an approach to teaching and learning that's very unlike traditional teaching and learning. The teacher facilitates a conversation rather than delivering content. Usually you sit in a circle and you go through a sort of a process where you have some sort of a settling activity, you have some sort of a stimulus to focus the children's minds. It might be a poem or a photograph or an object or a piece of music, say. You identify the big ideas behind the stimulus, and from that you generate philosophical questions. You have to do a little bit of work with the children around how to make good philosophical questions. I'm going to write a blog about that, which I'll talk about later on if you're interested to find out more. You share the questions, you vote on what people want to talk about, then you have first words, you build the conversation so that everybody gets to contribute and listen to one another. You try to formulate some sort of an answer to the question, then you go around the circle and you have a set of final words. It sounds quite formulaic, but when you see this in action, it's absolutely magic. If you type P4C into YouTube, you'll see what I mean. The fourth one was structured debates. One of the things that I'm really interested in is how seriously debating is taken in private schools. So if you look at schools like Eton and Harrow and Westminster, schools that pump out prime ministers at a rate of knots. Eton are now on their 20th prime minister. Westminster and Harrow have produced 6 or 7 each. And those schools really take debating very, very seriously. At Eton, they recently built a debating chamber that cost them £18 million, would you believe? You could build a whole school for that. And it looks like the House of Commons. It's sort of got rows of benches facing one another. One thing that I discovered that blew my mind recently is that when they do debates in these places, they refer to the two teams as the government and the opposition, and the individuals are referred to as the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister and so on. So they're literally role-playing for when they get to run the country, which is a good idea. You know, we should rehearse these things, but surely this game should be being played by every single child in every single school in every country on the planet. And so it's really important that we take the time to do this. The problem with it is that it's quite time consuming to run a debate in schools, so you need to think about how to build in time. I think this is one strong reason for why you should have a learning to learn curriculum. So this is the process that we would go through. The students would come up with a range of motions for debate. For example, video games cause violence, or we should close the zoos, or whatever it is that they want to talk about. You research the topic. It's really important that they know what they're talking about. We would spend 2 whole lessons on that. We would allocate 5 students to speaking positions for the debate lesson. There'll be 1 pupil chairing the debate, and then 2 for and 2 against. And we would also split the audience into for and against. And then we would have the debate lesson. And in the debate lesson, it would run like this, so that the audience would vote on the motion, for or against. Then you would have an opening statement. I now use this language, but we would just say, the leader of your team, so that you have opening statements by each member of the debating teams. Then you would have a chaired discussion where the chair would pick up points that they wanted to explore in more detail. We would open it up to questions from the floor. We would have summing up or closing comments from either side, and then the audience would vote again, and the audience would provide feedback on each person within the debate, first of all verbally and then written. And at first we were quite nervous about doing that because we thought, we don't want the children to be really critical of one another in a public forum. But it never happened. They were really, really sensitive, maybe because they knew that they would come to take their turn in the chair, in the spotlight, and they didn't want to, be critical because they would, get the same back. But children are really, really good at giving one another feedback when it comes to things like this. So they would get feedback verbally, and each child would also get 4 or 5 slips of written feedback as well, with areas for improvement for next time. So it's really powerful. And lastly, presentational talk. So we would run half-termly projects, and each of those projects would end in a teachable moment so that they would have to teach. And it wasn't always a class presentation. Maybe they would come and share something with the teacher. Maybe they would share something in a whole group. And we would set it up so that the children had a range of options regarding the level of challenge. So they could present to the whole class if they want. Sometimes they presented to a whole assembly, sometimes to the assemblies of every year group. The length of time that they do, are they using slides or not? Are they using props or not? Are they using notes? So they can increase the level of challenge as they do this over time. Again, they would get verbal and written feedback. And now we run language of power workshops. There's this fantastic TED talk by a guy called Simon Lancaster, who I've seen speak a few times now. And we now run language of power workshops where we teach children how to speak using a whole range of rhetorical devices. So our practice has developed a lot more since we were doing this in the learning skills curriculum. So what was the effect of all of this Oracy? Well, here are some excerpts from the student interviews that we did. Again, I'm not going to read through these. You can pause the video if you want to have a look. But you can see that the words that leap out are confidence and courage. It's in finding my voice, learning to stand up for myself. It's a really big deal. Like, these children were finding who they are for the first time. It's absolutely lovely. And this is it. It's all about confidence. If you teach children how to develop their ability to speak and listen, it really just helps them. You can almost see them walking an inch taller, and they start to think differently about themselves. They start to see themselves as somebody who can be that person who stands at the front of a room and who can make things happen, who can make some world-changing speech at some point in the future. So it's all about the confidence, and from the confidence, that's where all of the other stuff comes, the improved attainment in subject learning and so on. That all follows from this confidence that you get through this work. So that's a really quick whistle-stop tour through the Oracy elements of the learning skills curriculum. In the next few weeks, I'm going to be serializing the Oracy part of this book on the Oracy Cambridge blog, so keep an eye out for that. And if you want to pre-order a copy of that book for 35% discount for limited time only, go to tinyurl.com/fearmk and enter the promo code FEAR35. Thank you very much for your attention if you made it this far. My email address is there. You can tweet us at rethinking_ed, or I'm rethinkingjames on Twitter. Take care, and I will maybe see you again.